Hello, I'm Jenny Kleeman, and I'm excited to welcome you all today to this Selfridges Earth Day talk on climate activism. We have an international panel of great prestige, four esteemed speakers who are going to discuss how they are bringing about change. Let me introduce them to you. We have Alex Weller. He is Marketing Director for Patagonia, where he oversees marketing strategy for the brand throughout Europe. He is responsible for building communities through environmental activism and amplifying the company's mission of building a business that can help save our home planet. We also have Anita Okunde, who is an activist in the UK Student Climate Network, the grassroots youth climate strikes organisers in the UK. She works with Youth Climate Strikers Manchester and Fridays for Future to support climate action during the COVID-19 pandemic. We've also got Tyrone Scott, who is a London-based climate activist and Young Green Campaigns officer, where he leads the youth and student branch of the Green Party. He is passionate about including BAME communities and young people in conversations about climate justice. And last, but by no means least, we have Michael Mann, climatologist and geophysicist. He is currently director of the Earth System Science Center at Pennsylvania State University, where he has contributed to the scientific understanding of historic climate change based on the temperature record of the past 1,000 years. His new book is The Climate War, The Fight to Take Back Our Planet. So please extend a big virtual round of applause to our panel. Now, tonight's event is going to run for about an hour. The first 45 minutes or so, our speakers are going to be in conversation with me and with each other. And in the second part, we're going to be taking your questions. So do keep your questions coming. You can start by submitting them now in the question box that you can see on your screen. And if you want to leave your name, please do. If you want to direct it to a specific panelist, feel free to. But if you want to address a general question to the general panel, that is fine as well. So first off, why don't we kick off by introducing ourselves more formally, more properly. I'm going to ask each of you what climate activism means to you. Anita, maybe if we could begin with you.
Thank you. What climate activism means to me personally, that would be looking at ensuring that the people who are most affected by the climate crisis have the biggest say in the solutions. And although the climate crisis isn't targeting specific people, the actual effects of it are disproportionately affecting the groups that we see as the marginalized groups in our society today. So it's really important to ensure that when we talk about climate activism and how we are going to make these solutions to the climate crisis, we ensure that we're looking at the groups who are most affected by the climate crisis to give the solutions.
And Alex, what does it mean to you?
Yeah, I mean, I think 2021 is a huge year for everyone, and I think from a business perspective, recognizing the opportunity to lean in and embrace systemic solutions that are going to really help accelerate the necessary pace and the necessary intention to get to the right state, to move us forward. My role within that, both as a marketer and as a citizen, is to really, also lean into a solutions-oriented mindset and really get as many people on board as possible.
Tyrone.
Thank you. It's a really good question. And I think, very much like Anita said, it's about ensuring that those who are directly affected by climate change and the climate crisis are empowered to make change and seek the change that we need. And on a personal viewpoint, it's very much been about trying to seek empowerment as well. And I think with with so many young people who are so active, with climate change and trying to fight the climate emergency, I feel we need to look to try and empower communities to try and seek that change. So empowering young people to get in positions where they can make that change, and that's why I've tried to sort of get in positions politically where I can try and have some sort of influence to seek that change as well, because I feel like we need to try and get those positions where we are sort of making the decisions rather than just trying to change the minds of the decision makers, who often seem like their minds are often set in stone. So for me, it's really climate activism is about empowerment really.
And Michael, what is climate activism to you?
Yeah, I agree with everything that's been said thus far. As a scientist, I occupy a somewhat unusual role when it comes to issues of advocacy and activism. Those words were once dirty words in the scientific community. You were looked down upon as a scientist if you engaged in advocacy. One could argue that some of the greatest science communicators in history, like Carl Sagan, in a sense, were looked down upon by some of their fellow scientists because of their advocacy, and you might argue their activism. I was sort of forced into that role as a mild-mannered scientist back, 2 decades ago, when we published the now iconic hockey stick curve that became a symbol in the climate change debate. I suddenly found myself at the center of politically and ideologically motivated attacks against me and my science. And that sort of thrust me into the public sphere. Involuntarily, you might argue, but decades later, I've really come to embrace that role, although it wasn't the one that I signed up for. I can think of no greater privilege than being in a position to influence the conversation about what is arguably the greatest challenge that we face as a civilization.
So we have a very diverse panel of people who are looking at climate activism in different ways. We have a scientific perspective, a corporate perspective. We have somebody who is using political activism from the party perspective to make change, and someone who's very much a grassroots organizer. So from those 4 different viewpoints, I think for a lot of people, climate change can seem quite overwhelming to the average person. You can feel like, how are you going to be able to tackle a problem as great as rising sea levels, deforestation? So how do you motivate people to actively make a difference without scaring them off or making them feel like there's nothing they can do? Perhaps Tyrone, if you could begin.
Thanks. No, that's a really good question, and it's something I've spoken about before. In that, we are in a situation which is a climate emergency and a climate crisis, and time is essentially of the essence, and there is no time to waste. But I think we do have to be careful sometimes, or just not careful, maybe more mindful of the narrative in which we talk about the climate emergency. In that, yes, it is very much doom and gloom. There's nothing I could say to take away from that, but we don't want to maybe represent the situation in that it's too far gone, because if we do maybe say that to too much of a degree, then there's no motivation to make a change if it seems like no change is possible. So I think, for me, I think it's always mindful, as a climate activist and someone who's quite vocal and tries to get myself in positions where I can talk to audiences like today, in that amongst the desperation for us to take urgent action, both as globally, politically, through corporations and commercially, also the hope that there is, for change that can come, whether that's through, the shifts that we are seeing politically, whether small steps are always better than no steps, whether it's the rise of the movement from the youth, even as myself as a, I like to say I'm a young person, I definitely am, but as a 29-year-old, I look at the younger generation just below me, and the activists there are twice as many, I'd say, as when I was, 18, 19 years old, and that gives me hope as well. I feel like the leaders of tomorrow are going to completely revolutionize the world and change the mistakes from the leaders of today, and yes, time is of the essence and we do need to act now, and that will always be the message. We always have to be mindful of the fact that there is a bright horizon there, and we can seize the opportunity still.
Michael, how do you deal with that from a scientific perspective? Because the data is the data. You have a duty to present it as it is. How do you make sure that people don't lose hope in the face of the climate emergency that we are now faced with?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with what was just said. And this is, in fact, a major thrust of my book, The New Climate War. It's really about the new challenges that we face. The forces of inaction, the inactivists, as I call them, fossil fuel interests, those doing their bidding, they haven't given up, but they've now turned to an insidious array of new tactics in their effort from preventing us from moving on. And one of them, ironically, is to actually promote doomism and despair. Because if you really believe there's nothing that you can do about the problem, it potentially leads you down the same path of disengagement as outright denial. And the forces of inaction, they don't care about the path you take. They just care about the destination. They want you disengaged. And unfortunately, a lot of very good people, well-intentioned, good-meaning people have fallen into doom and despair because of that messaging that is sought to essentially rob them of agency. And as I like to point out, in really more or less the same thing that we just heard, there is urgency, but there is also agency. It isn't too late to make a difference. And the science supports that. An accurate, objective assessment of the best science available tells us that if we stop burning carbon, if we stop putting carbon pollution into the atmosphere, the planet stops warming up within a few years. And so there is a direct and immediate impact of our efforts to reduce carbon emissions. And the only obstacle at this point isn't a lack of solutions. It's whether or not we have the political willpower to do it. And I believe we do. I'm optimistic that we're actually going through an important moment right now where we're seeing that there is the will to act before it's too late.
Climate activism has had a kind of momentum over the past few years, hasn't it? It really feels like it was, there was a sea change almost in how we viewed climate activism, but then there came the pandemic. And I wonder what effect the pandemic has had on climate activism. Do you think it has made people care less about climate change, reorder their priorities, or has it made people realise that the world we're living in is really fragile and that we are in many ways not the masters of nature that we thought we were? Anita, maybe you could address that first.
I think from a youth perspective, the COVID type of situation didn't stop people from caring for climate change, but rather I think it engaged a lot of young people anyway to actually start caring. I work obviously with Fridays for Future Digital, which is the digital platform, and it allows more accessibility to young people to be able to climate strike and digital strike. And our team numbers have doubled, tripled over the pandemic. And it's amazing to see that more young people want to get involved. And it's amazing to see that young people are getting to learn about the climate crisis and its severity. And although we always want to make sure we're not pushing this message of it's all doom and gloom and it's not too far gone, I don't think there is enough urgency around the climate crisis and how it's actually described, especially when we're looking at the school systems and what we learn about the climate crisis. It sounds like a really far-fetched dream. It's not here, it's really far away. And because of that, it makes sure that a lot of young people don't think it's an important issue to actually speak about or be involved in. So ensuring that we are allowing young people to see this is a big deal. It's affecting us now. It's not going to affect us in a few years. It's happening now. And also allowing people to know that there is something they can do to help. And it's not going to be a tiny action that doesn't go to anywhere. It is something that is really helping the movement and is empowering them as well as people. If people feel empowered and feel like what they're doing is helping a bigger movement, they will want to continue to do it. They'll bring their friends to do it. They'll bring their family to do it. So I think it's really important that we ensure that people feel empowered because what they're doing is making a change, but we are making those changes.
And Alex, would you agree with that? Has the pandemic helped or hindered the movement?
Yeah, I think on a very human level, one of the things that we've all seen happen through the pandemic is a sort of a deeper connection and a reconnection to the things that are most important to people, and that which I think has been their immediate surroundings, their home and their family and their nearby nature. And in that sense, I think for a lot of people, a real kind of reconnection to how they on a human level relate to the natural world. And I think that through a sort of process of kind of serendipitous connection, I think, has created more sensitivity to these important topics. And I think while there may have been a period of time in the early days of the pandemic where people were a little bit just kind of freaked out and sort of immobilized by that moment in time, I think what emerged from that was a really, really deep connection with planetary issues. And I think, as Anita pointed out, and she's obviously seeing that with the UKSCN sort of membership, we've certainly seen people, really increasingly engage with the environmental stories that we tell as a business and how we connect. But I think more importantly, how people follow on and act as a result of engaging with these stories. So I do genuinely believe that the pandemic has been transformative within the movement in a variety of ways.
When it comes to attitudes and concerns about climate change and the climate emergency, there is a difference, isn't there, depending on your age? I've got some stats here for you. A YouGov survey from early 2020 found that 46% of 18 to 24-year-olds were very concerned about climate change, compared to 24% of those aged over 65. And it would be great if we could unpick that a little bit. Why do we think there is this disparity between age groups, and how should we address that? Tyrone?
No, it's a really interesting one. And whilst I've not seen those or heard those statistics before, on the one hand, it isn't that, in a weird way, not that surprising, even though it may be quite difficult to understand the reasoning why behind that. I'll be interested to hear what other panelists' thoughts are on that on that question too. I mean, I think as sort of said before, there is obviously definitely a thing with the younger generation now who have been definitely more aware of many social justice issues, just climate change being one of the many different ways in which young people become more active and more aware. And there's different reasons as to why that is, but I think that can play a big part. And that's not to say, obviously, the older generation are not, on board with many of the social justice issues, but you do see parallels with, which demographics are behind certain issues, and it's hard to often say why that might be. I think with the younger generation as well, it's very much been something we've grown up with, and I think especially if you've grown up even just 10 years younger than me, as say I'm 29, if you're 19, the climate crisis is something that you've heard about quite a lot throughout your whole life, especially the last sort of 10 years. So it's really, really formative into your beliefs, so I think it's easier for you to grasp that it's a reality. Whereas if you are of the older generation, quite often, there's never a generalization, but if it's looking at those numbers, I think it's just that hasn't been embedded as much, and other things have been embedded over the course of their lives. So I think that can often be one of the main factors there.
Anita, would you agree with that? It's to do with the world in which you're native, in which you're born into.
Yeah, I think to some extent, I'd say definitely the world in which we're born to have shaped what we think is important. But I also think young people have had to face a lot of the brunt of not the climate crisis specifically, but a lot of the different social justice things that are going on right. I mean, I'm not yet 18. I literally just turned 17. So looking at what I'm seeing, especially in the UK government, I have a lot of a different view on what people may think about social justice issues, because I've seen a different side of it. I don't think that young people specifically are listened to or have had the best type of period, especially with COVID, education, the climate crisis. When they speak about it, are they listened to by our governments, by our politicians? And I think when you put all these things together and you look at how young people are treated, you start to see why they would care a bit more and why they think it's a lot more important. And when you look at the future of young people and what they have, this is the planet they have to inherit at the end of the day. And when we're looking at what climate change is going to look like in the next 10, 20, 30 years, they're still going to be the people on the planet. They're still going to be the people who are living with the effects of this. So, of course, they're going to be a lot more worried. I can't speak for the older generation and why they wouldn't be as worried, but I think to a certain extent, because they don't have to stay here for as long as young people may have to, they definitely have a different type of thing to think about when looking at climate change, especially when climate change is portrayed as something that's going to happen in a few years. It's happening in 10 years time. We're not going to see the effects for another 15 years. When people look at it that way, and that's the way that it's portrayed in the media, then maybe it's easier to just say, well, it's not a big thing for me now. It's not going to be a big thing for me in the next 10 years. So why think about it as much?
Michael, I'm not going to ask you to speak for an older generation, but I think it wouldn't be unfair to suggest that you are older than 17. How do you think we can engage an older demographic in the issues of climate activism?
Yeah, well, by definition, young is always my age or younger. And so I still see myself as a youngster, not quite as much so as some of the other panelists. I thought that both Anita and Tyrone make some great points here. And I think, we'd probably want to look at the crosstabs of that poll to really get more insight into where those numbers are coming from. And I'm not a pollster, I'm not a political scientist, but I am a student of our climate discourse, and I have some insights into what might be going on there. It's been said that science advances one funeral at a time, and one could make that argument when it comes to sort of our discussions of the implications of science, of climate science. I think there's an array of factors here. I fall in between those two groups you mentioned. I'm not quite in that oldest demographic or that youngest demographic, but there are a few things going on here. Part of it is that cultural, climate change denialism has been part of our culture in the past, and people growing up today haven't been immersed in that same culture because we've largely moved on from outright denial for obvious reasons, as we've already talked about here. The impacts of climate change are no longer abstract. They're not far off. They're here and now. We're witnessing devastating impacts of climate change. It makes it very difficult to deny that it's real, and people who've grown up in this era have seen the impacts that it's having. There is also the issue, I hate to say it, of to some extent, there's some selfishness here on the part of those who, feel like, well, they've had their turn, they got what they could out of life, and perhaps aren't thinking as much as they should be about what sort of world they want to leave behind for their children and grandchildren. We all care about the world we leave behind for future generations, for our children and grandchildren. And it has to be framed that way. And I think one of the most powerful things about the youth climate movement is that it has helped reframe this issue. For too long, we allowed it to reside almost exclusively in the domain of science and policy and economics and politics. But more than anything else, this is an issue of ethics, of intergenerational ethics, our obligation not to degrade this planet for future generations. And so I think there is a generational shift. And I'll cite one more statistic that's sort of encouraging. Among Republicans, so I'm talking about conservative Americans, Republicans under the age of 40, there is overwhelming acceptance of climate change, that the climate crisis exists. And there's overwhelming support for climate solutions, for renewable energy, for doing something. And so there are reasons for encouragement, but we have to keep pushing. It won't happen if we don't push.
I want to talk now about direct action climate activism and groups like Extinction Rebellion, who, when they first started off, certainly here in the UK, I think people were really intrigued by them, and they got quite a lot of positive coverage, but now certain sections of the media have, I think it's fair to say, turned against them. They say that their tactics are disruptive and are turning people off climate activism, and they're alienating people. Alex, what do you think of that view?
I think there are so many important parts to play within this movement and so many different ways to be effective. And I think nonviolent civil disobedience has proven to be an incredibly effective tool to raise awareness in the general public and to raise awareness and to provoke governments and political decision making into response. Now, of course, it isn't everybody's cup of tea, right? And it does and it certainly on a day-to-day basis can let's say annoy certain people. But I think it is a critically important part of the work that needs to be done. So much so as a company that we actually enable and encourage employees who want to take part in nonviolent civil disobedience to do so. And we also support them with bail funds and legal support should they be arrested and removed from non-violent civil disobedience. But it isn't the only lever that needs to be pulled. And I think to the earlier point, and I think this also plays a little bit to the point you were discussing with regards to the different levels of engagement due to kind of age or sociodemographics or where you live in the world or what your political points of view are, there is a part to play for everybody. And I think it is important for us who are, and certainly as a business, who are trying to engage as many people as we can in solutions, to recognize that there are different roles that people can play. And for somebody who is that way inclined, fantastic. But if you're a retired, more conservatively minded person, perhaps engaging in renewable energy cooperatives and starting, a solar cooperative in your village might be the way that you're going to take part in the climate revolution. So I think the short answer is it's very, very important, and I think the long answer is it's not for everybody.
Anita, I wonder what you make of it, and I wonder what you think of the idea that the targets of activism really matter, that who you're protesting against and where and how can make a crucial difference when you look at how the public responds to your activism.
Okay, yeah. So for all the targets you've just mentioned, these are the reasons why I personally dislike Extinction Rebellion and their way of activism. Extinction Rebellion's main point of becoming the arrestables, for me, is uncomfortable. I feel like it excludes a lot of people, especially Black, Indigenous people of color, from their activism, because this whole point of being arrestable and making it desirable to be arrestable isn't safe for everyone. And also, when Extinction Rebellion is practicing its demonstrations, they tend to affect the working class. And these are the people that they need to get the support of, especially when looking at the climate crisis and who it's affecting. So when they do these big demonstrations that disrupt mostly the working class, it's hard for them to be on their side. And I feel like that is why Extinction Rebellion recently has been demonized in the media, compared to when they first started off, which their demonstrations were still big, but I felt like at the time they were powerful and they were making a difference. But now it's becoming disruptive to the people they should be caring about helping. And I think also when we look at the organizational structures of Extinction Rebellion, they're not very diverse. And as a group, they've been problematic when it comes to their diversity and how they address their activism and what groups they exclude when they participate in their activism in this way. So for me, it's not about are they wrong or right to do what they do. It's how can they make it more inclusive? How can they make their demonstrations more inclusive? Where is it suitable to have these massive demonstrations on the train station or outside the big banks? Which is more suitable? And I think when we're looking at Extinction Rebellion and where they do these demonstrations, I think it's unfair for how they do it. Like, there are so many better places, so many better people to get your message, the people you should be getting your message across to. And I feel like Extinction Rebellion, with all the, not power, but the name and like how big they are, especially for the climate crisis movement, they don't carry that weight well, and they don't do it in a way that, could actually really pull some real big strings. And I feel like personally they've kind of given the youth climate movement like a bit of a tarnish, because you think Extinction Rebellion, you think the whole lot of us. So I think it's important to ensure that when we think of Extinction Rebellion, yes, some of their actions are great, they get people talking and they get people noticing the climate crisis movement, but how inclusive are they as a group, and how inclusive are their tactics?
Alex, do you want to come back on that point? I know you weren't defending Extinction Rebellion there, but you were saying how your company supports people if they are arrested. But Anita makes a good point, doesn't she? That being arrested means different things to different people.
She absolutely does. She makes a fantastic point, and I think one of the very powerful lessons that 2020 and the early part of 2021 has taught and continues to teach us is that we need to be really aware of all of the intersectional dimensions of the work that we do and how the work that we do can inadvertently affect more marginalized communities. I think Anita makes a very salient and very important point, and one that I agree with.
I want to move on to big business here. So big business is often seen as an obstacle to change. Do you think that is still true, or have the attitudes of businesses shifted over the past few years? Michael?
Sure. Well, it depends on which sectors of big business we're talking about. If we're talking about the fossil fuel industry, then there's no question that they have engaged for decades in a massive public disinformation campaign to confuse the public and policymakers about the nature of the problem. Today, they are using an array of tactics, as I alluded to earlier, in their effort to defeat sort of climate action. And often that involves division, creating wedges within the community. And we've just had a conversation about that in the context of Extinction Rebellion. Wedges that actually can potentially divide the movement. It's a divide and conquer sort of technique that has proven very effective in defeating activism in the past, and we have to look out for it, and we have to be aware of it. We have to be aware of those efforts to divide us so that we don't speak with a single voice demanding action. So the fossil fuel industry, there's no question that historically they have played a somewhat villainous role. There are some energy companies today that I think do see that the path forward on energy is going to be renewable energy, and they're trying to work in that direction. But you still have some very bad actors in that space, ExxonMobil and Shell and others. Chevron, which I talk about this in my book, Chevron actually tried to foment racial division. There was a memo that got leaked. They were trying to foment racial division within the climate movement by convincing climate activists that renewable energy would be a threat to lower income and frontline communities. So we have to be aware of the fact there are some bad actors within that space. That having been said, there are some good actors in the technology community, some of the leading tech companies, and in many cases, there's a younger leadership there. They're sort of closer to this issue. They've followed it more carefully. They are doing things to try to, move their companies in the right direction. Many of our largest companies in the United States, for example, stressed their continued commitment to the Paris Agreement, even as our previous president, Donald Trump, threatened to pull out of it. The banking industry, the finance industry, we might think of these as some of the most conservative institutions within our business community. And yet increasingly, they see climate as a major source of risk. It's a source of transition risk, which is to say, fossil fuel companies are bad investments. We shouldn't be funding them. We shouldn't be investing in them because they are going to have to leave most of their assets stranded in the ground. They are going to be forced to do so. So you can even make an argument based purely on business considerations that we should be divesting of funding for fossil fuels. And we see enlightened players within the banking industry and the finance community that recognize that. They are starting to decarbonize their portfolios. BlackRock, Bank of England, many other leaders in that space. And and then there's the physical risk. Look, there is no economy on a dead planet. So if you care about the future of our economy and the future of business, you're going to want to do something about climate change. And I think there's an increasingly broad coalition of institutions, actors within the business world that are recognizing this. And in many cases, it's generational. Younger leadership is leading to a greater awareness and a greater commitment to acting on the climate crisis in the business community.
I want to talk about social media now. And Tyrone, I wonder if I could begin with you. Do you think it is a force for good in climate activism, or does it engender itself to particularly polarized conversations that don't draw people in the way that would be useful for the movement?
Yeah, it's a tricky one, I think, because, I think if we can take away just, let's say, the subject of climate activism, just any of these sort of social justice issues at the moment that, that can very much bring about quite polarized views. Social media can be as much as a force for good as it can be as a force for good, or a force for bad, or force for evil. And we've seen the consequences of that, time and time again. So it can be such a useful tool if utilized correctly. And when we look at things, even about mass demonstrations, mass non-violent direct action, the ways these are mobilized and organized, really frequently wouldn't be possible without social media. And again, that's with climate activism, and on all other types of activism. It's been such a useful tool. But the other side of that coin, or the double-edged sword, is that the misinformation that is spread, through social media, the lack of verification, just those two things in itself, cause so many issues. The tendency to share these so frequently without even checking, no fact checking, it's become so much of a norm that people on both sides of the fence have to be careful about. We see a favorable headline that really fits our confirmation bias, and we'll look to share that in a moment. And I think we've really got to be careful of that with news stories, with memes. It can sound silly to talk about memes as a danger, but it's very much true. You put a picture on with a couple of convincing sentences, and it gets shared around 20,000 times as if it's fact. And we could joke about it, but unless you do take it seriously, then you can't tackle the disinformation. So you have to understand this as a real and present threat to facts, basically, and that causes big issues. It causes in the worst effects, radicalization, of groups, and we see that with the conflicts around race, globally at the moment. So again, when it comes back to climate activism, it's the same. The same risks are there, with social media, but I think it's one of those things where it does exist. It's going to continue to exist. So we have to ensure that this side uses it in the right way, and to build networks, create networks, share correct information, and use it in a positive light, and not fall into the traps that are so easy to fall into with social media that we've seen time and time again.
Anita, I wonder what you make of that, and also of the idea that social media might encourage a certain kind of signalling which might not translate into action. What would you say to that?
I think I definitely agree. I think what I've seen over social media is it's allowed a lot more young people to actually take part in the actions that we tend to do. Not everyone can march in the streets. Not all schools are as welcoming to our usual youth strikes. So social media has been a great way for accessibility to allow more young people not only to learn about the issues, but also take part in our digital strikes. However, on the other side of the coin, I think it's allowed for a lot of cloutivism, talking without any action. And I think it's allowed not only for young people or the average person to talk about any action or without doing anything, but also it's allowed politicians and big companies to do a lot of talking without any action. I think everyone could put a social media post saying how much they care, but where's the action to actually back that up? And I think it's something that it's been looked at in the average person, and how the fact that not everyone is the same way they are on social media. Social media is how you present yourself, and everyone can present themselves in a way that's desirable to the public. However, what are the actions we're going to take to actually ensure that we are really backing up our words? How are we going to show that we care about the planet? How are we going to show that we are actually doing something to actively fight climate change? And I think it's one thing to address in the youth movement and the movements in general, how we ensure that people who class themselves as activists are actually doing the active work, but also to ensure when we're looking at politicians and big companies, when they have these greenwashing campaigns, which they do a lot, how do we ensure that we are actually holding them responsible and ensuring that we are seeing the action that they promised? And I think that's a big thing, especially now within the youth climate movement, with a campaign, action, not promises. And I think it's really important that we see a lot of promises, especially on social media, on how big companies and politicians are going to do better, and how they have these amazing targets that look great, and how they're working towards that, and spreading it to the public, as social media is for. to ensure that everyone feels like, do you know what, something's being done. We don't have to do anything. Let's take a step back. But how are we ensuring that we are seeing actions behind this? What is the changes they're making? How are they making them? And are they really beneficial for the planet? Or is it just a bit of greenwashing? So I think that's where social media has a big part to play.
The climate emergency has a big impact on the global south, and yet quite often discussions about climate activism are very Western centric. How can we broaden out the narrative? How do we include and listen to more people from around the world in the global fight against climate change? Alex.
Yeah, another great question, and I think something that everybody that is involved and motivated by engaging as many people as possible in the climate movement and making it as inclusive as it can possibly be is thinking about, and especially now, recognizing that the sort of the ownership of the climate activist story, and again, I think Anita spoke to this very succinctly earlier, has lived within a very small and not particularly inclusive set of communities, and I think it's all of our responsibilities to ensure that that the story of this important work involves as many people as we possibly can. And I think there are different ways that we can do that. I think first and foremost, recognizing that, for example, some of the most affected communities are in places that aren't even seen or heard. For example, the indigenous communities of the Arctic North, whose land is melting underneath their feet, and the places where they have built their ancestral homes for millennia have, in the space of 50 years, turned essentially into mush, and they have to walk away and leave. And one of the things that we can do as a company is to help tell that story. And in fact, the story of the Newtok peoples of the Arctic North is a story that we're in the process of telling, and that is one thing, getting people to be aware of and pay attention to those issues. But of course, the other thing is us not just telling that story on behalf of other people. How do we ensure that those people's voices are included in the action that we take as well, and recognizing that the importance of climate justice, not just climate activism, is present within our work. And I think that will be a learning journey for everyone that is involved in this work. For us, it has been a powerful learning journey, and there is there is a long way to go, but we've got to cover that ground quickly.
Anita, I have to go back to you because you were nodding so vigorously there. What do you want to say?
Yeah, I think everything that's been said was amazing, and I think it's important to note that a lot of the activists, especially youth activists in the global south, being activists is illegal. It's risking their lives. And I think it's a privilege to be an activist and not have to care about things like being arrested, or just for your activism, not for disrupting. And I think it's important to note that a lot of these activists who are speaking out from the global south are doing it from a position where they are in danger and being threatened. And so when we want to give them platforms and allow them to share the solutions, I think it's important that they are invited and they're made welcome in these platforms. I mean, things like today, having them speak at panel events is really important. Having their voices being heard is really important. And I think COP26 this year is a very, very important, and this would be a great opportunity to have voices from the global south and have voices from those most affected regions actually be there and give their solutions. And I think especially this year, it's important to look at how do we involve the global south in our solutions, and how do we ensure that we are listening to those in the most affected regions when we're looking at climate solutions, because I think this year has exacerbated really the effects that they're having on these countries, on these places. And I think when we're looking at the climate crisis and who it's affecting, ensuring that regardless of cost across the board, those disproportionately affected by the climate crisis, on the basis of where they are, on the basis of gender, on the basis of race, ensuring that we are looking at a table that is diverse when speaking about the issue, not just at government level, but also at the grassroots level, ensuring that our organizers in the climate movement, ensuring that when we're looking at leadership structures, that we have Black, Indigenous, people of color, people from the global South in those structures to give their input and give them a space where they feel comfortable for doing that. Because having a space and saying like, oh, it's there, they can have it, is a lot different from them actually feeling welcome and feeling like their voices are heard in that space. So ensuring that we have those spaces that are comfortable and their voices are being heard, and we are not just making them speak for speaking's sake. We're ensuring that their speaking and their solutions are being turned into real life solutions and being implemented in policy is really important.
Now is a good time to take questions from the floor. You can keep those questions coming. There is a box in which you can do so. They're being fed through to us, so do keep asking your questions. Here's a question from Alex. What would be the panelists' hope for government action in the next 3 years? Michael.
Well, I mean, it's what we've been talking about this week, Earth Week, where we've had this summit hosted by Joe Biden of the nations of the world, bringing them together to make sure that we have actionable targets and actionable goals going into the all-important COP26 meeting later this year. I think that, the Biden administration, Joe Biden sort of laid down the gauntlet by committing the United States to reducing carbon emissions by a factor of 2 within the next decade. That's what we have to do globally if we are to stay on a path that averts the worst impacts of climate change, that averts warming of more than 1.5 degrees Celsius, where we'll really start to see some of the most damaging and permanent impacts of climate change. There's still a narrow window, but we have to decarbonize our civilization quickly. There's a lot of talk by some countries about mid-century targets, 2050, becoming carbon neutral or net zero by 2050. Well, that's good. That would be consistent with remaining on that path. But that's really kicking the can very far down the road. We need targets that actually constrain what we're going to do over the next several years, over the next decade. Now, it's one thing to commit to those targets, and the United States, by doing so, has put pressure on other countries, some intransigent countries like Australia under Scott Morrison, that has shown a lack of real commitment to climate action. This really puts pressure on some of the other countries, but we're going to need to see this codified in terms of action, in terms of legislation in the United States. There's certain things that a president can do through executive actions, and Joe Biden's doing a lot of those things, but we need legislation. We need climate bills to pass Congress that will provide subsidies for renewable energy, that will put a price on carbon, that will remove the support for additional development of fossil fuel infrastructure. These are all things that can't just be done by the president alone. So look, there's some great commitments that have been made. I think there's some reason for cautious optimism that by the time we get to COP26 later this year, we are going to have commitments from the leading polluters of the world that really do start to align with those goals, those targets of averting catastrophic warming. But where the rubber hits the road is legislation that actually codifies those promises and those commitments. We need to see it here in the United States, we need to see it in Europe, and we need to see it around the world.
Tyrone, do you want to come in on that? What your hope for government action over the next 3 years?
Yeah, of course. Thank you. And there's so many things that the government should do and choices they should make, and it should have made a long time ago. But I very much agree about the need for us to work in harmony globally on this. And I think the UK at the moment is at threat of cutting itself off, due to obviously the decisions that we've made over the last few years. And I think since leaving the European Union, it's more important than ever the UK is what really sets a standard for tackling the global climate emergency, and at the very least is not left behind by the standards set across Europe and globally. And that's why one of the things I think the UK government needs to do is to continue to seek its membership with the European Environment Agency as a sort of a first step to at least ensure we are on an alignment with our European friends and neighbours across the continent, and continue to do we'll make every step we can to address this globally, because when it comes to tackling the climate emergency, it is a global issue, and it only works if everybody pulls in together. What happens in one area of the world does affect the other area of the world. And whilst we do have our own ecosystems and microclimates in our area, the world does not work in that way, and we have to address this through combined and agreed goals. And it's something I try and embed into my work as much as I can, if possible. I'm looking forward to COP26 this year, and I've been fortunate enough to be selected as a delegate with the Federation of Young European Greens, and really excited at the prospect of working with other young European Greens, and also equally saddened by the fact that this is almost a juxtaposition of working in alignment with the government, and no longer doing that with the EU, and I feel it's sad that it's not something that's going to be the norm potentially moving forward. But I think the most important thing for our government is to ensure that we do meet strong net zero targets, 2030 ideally, and really setting out how that with a clear plan, and really convincing our neighbours globally to do the same, and not losing touch with them as we set these goals and achieve them.
If it would be possible for me to just add for a moment, there are some really impactful things that citizens can do right now to participate in that legislative process. Just in the UK, there's a bill that is trying to put through Parliament called the local electricity bill, which will make it possible for citizens to produce and share their own electricity by building their own renewable energy community projects. Now, which sounds quite simple, but this is a hugely transformative idea. Currently, there's only about 1 million people in Europe that generate and consume their electricity this way. But if this opens up through legislation, both in the UK at an EU level and is passed into law at a country level, by 2030, we could have up to 250 million Europeans generating and consuming their own electricity and benefiting from that, and disconnecting themselves from the monopolized system of, the incumbent monopolized system of energy production and distribution. There's some really, really radical things that are available to us right now, and there is legislation in the way, but people can participate. With the local electricity bill, you can write to your local MP in the UK and just ask them to support it. They only need around 250 more MPs to get it over the line. It's a really big deal, and it could really transform the status of renewable energy consumption in the UK.
A question from Corinne here. Can panelists give anecdotal evidence of activism by them, or in which they've involved themselves, panning out into concrete action, either a change of direction or adoption of a goal? Maybe raise your hand if you want to start with that, because I want to make sure that I'm picking on the right person here. If any of you participated in something or know of action, Tyrone.
So I guess the example I'd look to speak is more on direct influence on policy that could hopefully then have a larger knock-on effect. So through my work with the Young Greens, I'd worked to try and set and pass a motion around acknowledging the impact of colonialism and the transatlantic trafficking of enslaved Africans on both the social, economic, and both and also the ecological harms of that awful venture, and try to pass that as a motion with the Young Greens to basically call for an all-party parliamentary commission for truth and reparatory justice. And we worked as a small policy group to get that passed as a Young Green policy. But the real impactful part of this was getting this passed as part of a large project group with other divisions of the Green Party, such as the Greens of Colour, the Young Greens of Colour, and others, to get this past the first major political party to basically have an official policy to basically acknowledge, apologise, and pay reparations for the transatlantic traffic and enslaved Africans, but also to address the global inequalities and the harms caused by that process, which, as I state, is social, economic, and ecological. Because I don't think it can be downstated the impact of colonialism that continues to this day. It's because of colonialism that we've I say we, but the West has been able to have access to the land that they've been able to ravage and destroy in the pursuit of often unethical capitalism. And it's these things that still need to be recognized. And I've been very, very proud to be part of a team that has caused or has become the first major political party to pass that. We continue to then try and continue that in local government, and have had so far the Bristol Council to accept that as a motion and a position of their local authority in that city, and try to do that through more cities across the country, and therefore hopefully then become UK policy.
Anita, your hand was up too.
So an example of direct action, I think my favorite direct action I've done was working with Fridays for Future Digital. I was the coordinator of a press conference, and it was looking at what we were speaking about, ensuring that Indigenous people of the Global South's voices are heard when we're having discourse around the climate crisis and the solutions that can be given. So this press conference in particular was Indigenous people solely, on all Indigenous panel, and it was also in the lead up to the expiry date of what was the Escazú Agreement, and having it ratified by, we needed 11 more leaders to ratify the agreement, and it's ensuring that we protect lands in specifically like the Jamaica type of region, which was Indigenous land that had been exploited over the past years. And this agreement was meant to make sure that these lands are protected and these lands were kept sacred the way they were. So having this press conference and having the digital storms that we had in the week leading up, actually had the agreement ratified, which I think was like my biggest kind of, when looking back, like, oh, we really did that. We really helped implement something, and that was such a big thing, because I think there's a lot of notions around, especially digital activism, not being as effective. And I think with the pandemic forcing us only to have digital activism, seeing how it's affected these different things is really great, and how we've actually been able to make massive change regardless of whether we're out on the streets or whether we're online at a computer screen.
There have been a lot of questions about practical steps, bits of advice that you could give our audience. And in the closing minutes of this, I'd like to hear from all four of you. What advice would you give to our audience watching today about how they can get involved in the climate movement, and what positive steps they could make today to make a difference? Michael?
Sure. Well, this is really the message of my book, The New Climate War. We need both urgency and agency. So we have to recognize that dangerous climate change impacts are upon us, but it's not too late for us to do something about it. And for the individual, the problem isn't finding ways to make a difference. The problem is choosing among so many ways that you can make a difference. Obviously, voting is critical. Look, in the United States, young voters came out in this last election and they voted on climate. Climate was the #1 issue among many of our voters. And look at the difference that it made. We went from having a president who was the sole country in the world to pull out of the Paris Accord, to a president who has now moved forward with the boldest agenda of any American president yet. And we have a Congress that's controlled by Democrats, just narrowly, but there's an opportunity to complement the actions that are being taken by the current administration with meaningful climate legislation as well. So using your voice, there's so many ways to do it. Voting your voice, banding together, collective action that puts pressure on policymakers, that puts pressure on companies, and that can be in the form of nonviolent protest. The effort to raise awareness about the threat of additional fossil fuel infrastructure here in the United States is in part, we can thank activists who protested pipeline construction, or protested at the site of mountaintop removal coal mines. That has raised awareness, and it's put pressure on politicians, for example, to, like Joe Biden, who has said that there will be no more allowing of drilling and pipeline construction on public lands. It's made a real difference. Activism makes a real difference. And so it's about using your voice in every way possible and bringing along those who have fallen into despair. What's so tragic and pernicious is that many of those who would be most likely to be on the front lines advocating for action, calling for action, have instead fallen into despair and doom because of the effort by powerful interests to convince them it's too late. Recognize those folks when you encounter them and make sure they understand that it's not too late. Let's move them from disengagement back into the category of the engaged, because we all have to be on the front lines advocating for change if we're going to defeat the forces of inaction that are still well-funded and still organized. We can do it, but it's going to take all hands on deck.
Alex, what advice would you be giving to people who want to make a difference?
Well, first and foremost, I'm going to double up on vote, or at least be politically engaged. And I think one of the things that I spoke to is there are so many things that you can do at a political engagement level. Understand what your local MP, how your local MPs or your local political representative is engaged in climate and environmental issues, and issues of social and climate justice, and lobby them with your personal voice. You would be surprised how impactful it can be to write a letter or to show up at an MP's clinic and have a conversation. So get involved in that process. I think one thing that we can all do is finance. Change your pension, change your banking, and tell all your friends and family to do the same. Right? There are loads of better options than the options that most of us choose. And as Michael rightly pointed out earlier, finance is basically underpinning a broken fossil fuel-based system. Right, and there isn't much else still underpinning it other than global financial systems, which includes banking and pension and other mechanisms. The sooner that we as citizens can extract ourselves from that, and we could all do it today or tomorrow, the better. So get that done. The third thing is a really blatant plug to watch We the Power, the latest Patagonia film, and then go and join a renewable energy cooperative and disconnect yourself from the monopolized electricity grid and create a citizen-oriented, citizen-benefiting energy movement. 3 things.
Tyrone, what's your advice?
Thank you. So yeah, I mean, it's hard to beat the advice I've just been given there. But one thing that Alex said earlier really struck me, which is there isn't only one lever that can be pulled, and I think it's always good to be conscious of that fact. And you sometimes you may think I can't contribute as much as these activists that I'm seeing, and therefore I can't really contribute to the movement. And there are so many different ways in which you can. And I definitely want to double or triple down on and realizing the power of your voice. Whether that's just writing to your councillor and writing to your MP, directing efforts toward local issues around air pollution and traffic congestion and things around that. You can make a difference locally, you can make a difference regionally just from using your voice. And I'd always really recommend getting involved in the democratic process. And aside from that, the democracy isn't just through politics. Democracy is also through building of community groups and the building of power and empowerment of communities, and that's when you can get your voice heard too. So see what community groups are already in your area, form a community group between a few like-minded neighbors, just where you can talk about how being climate conscious, and these small steps will make a difference. And there's everyday things we can all do in our living, and I never try to put too much pressure on I think sometimes the folly of a personal carbon footprint, which absolutely we do always have to be mindful of. But I think there's definitely been an effort to make us all worry about that too much, rather than the big causes of climate change, which is often the large corporations. So we do have to be mindful of our everyday actions, of course, but find a way to use your voice. I think to make systematic change is always the most important and best thing we can all do.
I think Michael was desperate to chip in here. Michael.
Oh, just a double thumbs up on that. That's one of the messages as well in my book. Look, we should all do those things that we can do in our everyday lives that decrease our individual carbon footprint. They make us feel better. They save us money. They make us healthier. They set a great example for other people. But make no mistake about it. There's a reason that British Petroleum gave us the very first carbon footprint calculator, individual carbon footprint calculator, because British Petroleum and other fossil fuel companies want us so focused on our own individual carbon footprint that we fail to notice theirs. 70% of our global carbon emissions come from just 100 polluters.
We are running out of time, but Anita, we cannot go without asking for your advice. What advice would you give to people who have heard what we've been saying today and want to get involved?
I mean, yeah, just echoing the points that have been already mentioned. I think definitely allowing your voice to be heard is one of the biggest ones. And it doesn't have to be through just voting, I think is always my biggest thing. A lot of young people think that they shouldn't they shouldn't do anything or they can't do anything until they get the right to vote. I mean, I don't yet have the right to vote, and I think I've been able to do a lot for the climate movement. And I think it's important that young people see that, and they see that, you know what, you don't need to get directly involved in politics, as in looking at our big parties, but looking at how from the ground upwards and looking in our communities what we can do to actually collectivize each other and actually, you know, group together and make these changes down here. And maybe as time goes along, they get pushed up there to where we need them to be in government. And I think another thing is your money speaks. If you have the opportunity to buy from smaller businesses, more eco-conscious businesses, and you've done the research, it's a lot more better to do that. I never have that as something that people should do. Like, it's an absolute must, because I think when we look at who's actually causing, again, the carbon emissions, it's not the individuals, and the focus shouldn't be on individuals, and the blame shouldn't be on individuals. But it can be very empowering to do those little steps as an individual, to kind of, you know, when you look at it and you're like, I have lowered my carbon emissions personally, my family has, my group has. It's a really great way to feel. You feel great about yourself afterwards. But not let us think that that's the only way. Those individual, even if we sort out all our individual carbon emissions, we still have to fight the big companies. So I think it's important that we hold them accountable, we hold governments accountable by using our voices, and we hold big corporations accountable by moving our money. But it's really important that we have a balance of both individual action and collective.
We're going to have to leave it there, I'm afraid. But thank you so much. It's been such a privilege to hear all of your voices, a really fascinating discussion. I want the audience to extend with me a big virtual round of applause to Tyrone, Anita, Michael, and Alex. And it's good to leave with not just so many positive, concrete steps that we can all take, but also a sense of hope. So I'd like you all to go off and enjoy the rest of your evening and feel inspired. Thank you so much.